So good morning. This is working too? Is Olivia just ran out? Is she coming back in?
She's going out.
Okay, well, I'll just do all the other housekeeping then. We're very fortunate to have two really good speakers here again, for this is the 5th day. And Professor Lahra Smith, who is here from Georgetown University, and Professor Sana Haroun, who will be regaling us with not one but two little presentations. And I want to make sure that you've had a chance to see what the Indian Ocean website is going to look like when it's reprogrammed. We hope by November, hopefully by NCSS, it will be up. So I was able to bring it up there. Also, just wanting to keep in mind the evaluations sheet that we need to finish for today. This is our reporting for Title VI, as I mentioned yesterday, but just want to remind you. And she's still upstairs.
She's troubleshooting.
Okay, well, hopefully there's no trouble to shoot today. So, anyway, I wanted to, let me just bring it back up, please. And then when she comes back in, we can plug her. Anyways, come on in, because I want to get us moving.
I love the spelling of your name. It's unusual.
Olivia has just run out of the room, but Becca Smith is here, and I know I have mentioned them before, but since we will probably this afternoon all be ready to go our separate ways, I want to make sure in the morning that I recognize these two lovely ladies. Olivia is actually a high school student at, is she coming? Olivia is a high school student at Sidwell Friends who is thinking about coming to Georgetown, and we would certainly love to have her. Come on in. Becca Smith has been helping me on a number of workshops, loves education outreach, and of course you know some of the things we've had to deal with being in different venues this week and dealing with food, so Becca and Olivia have been keeping us filmed and fed and watered and all of those good things. So I'd like to have a round of recognition for them, and also the coin of the recognition realm is a Starbucks. Okay.
This has been a fantastic group. I really enjoyed being around you, so thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, without them, I would have been much more insane than I often felt as it was. So bring back that. And okay, so our first speaker is Lahra Smith, and I can tell we're going to have a number of encounters this year. We're already planning several things in the realm of collaboration with African Studies and also Howard University. Lahra Smith is Associate Professor in the African Studies program at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Her book entitled Making Citizens in Africa, Ethnicity, Gender, and National Identity in Ethiopia focuses on the role of political institutions in addressing conflict based largely on ethnic and language identities. Her ongoing research interests include equality in citizenship and citizen education and political reform. She has a current project looking at health policy and citizenship in Kenya. She's worked for USAID and Oxfam America, taught at Addis Ababa University and with high school teachers in Ethiopia, and has served as an election observer in Ethiopia and Kenya. So please welcome Lahra Smith.
Great, perfect. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to sort of think about these topics in a new way, and I've enjoyed catching myself up on some of the literature in preparation for today. In fact, I have a few additional articles to the couple that I assigned that I wanted to share, and I'll make sure to work with Susan to get those put in Dropbox or wherever for you, and I'll be citing some of them this morning. But thank you. And actually, I wanted to say something about sort of the context for my discussion today. My early thoughts on, I'm a political scientist first of all, so I should say I'm a bit humbled to be in a room full of historians. We political scientists don't do history very well generally, so I'll try to do better on that reputation. But it will be, I'm sure, a slightly different sort of take on things. I will talk quite a bit about 20th century history in East Africa, and then end with some discussion of contemporary trends of East Africa, Indian Ocean, interactions, migrations, and so on. And in some ways that will loop me back to this beginning, because much of the discussion today will not necessarily involve Ethiopia, which throughout the late 19th and much of the 20th century was, at least in the context of the Indian Ocean world, somewhat insular. But as Susan said, my own work, my primary field work has been in Ethiopia for many years, though I started in Kenya before that, looking at language policy and also working with high school civics teachers, so folks who do work somewhat similar to your own. So a real pleasure for them, and definitely we'll sort of end with a discussion of Ethiopians and Eritreans who are very much moving in and around and through the Middle East and the Indian Ocean world for a variety of reasons. So I'll say a few things about that at the end. But I have also had the pleasure of sort of working in other parts of this Indian Ocean world. In fact, when I worked for USAID, I worked with the International Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is based there in Djibouti. So I was working in Kenya, but I was working with the regional office with IGAD. And so had the opportunity to travel so close to the tip of Yemen, and not yet been there, but see sort of firsthand some of the long-standing historical connections between the Horn of Africa and other parts of the Indian Ocean world. And then I did work in Kenya, and then more recently, we have a summer program in Tanzania. So I'll talk quite a bit about Kenya and Tanzania today. And Georgetown has a summer program in Tanzania where we take undergraduate students and sometimes graduate students for intensive Kiswahili and sort of life and culture seminar in Tanzania. And I've done that almost every year since I've been here at Georgetown. So often thought about these sorts of questions in that day-to-day sense. So it's a pleasure to sort of talk about them with you today. But I wanted to start my discussion with an interesting case. Let's see if this hyperlink business is all going to work. Of course, I have to skip the ad, right? Continue to cite. With an interesting sort of personal anecdote that illustrates some of the late 19th century interactions of East Africa and the Indian Ocean history right up through the present day. Mohammed Dewji is a member of parliament in Tanzania today. He's also the chairman of a large corporation called Mohammed Enterprises TL, METL. I always forget what the TL stands for. He's a fourth generation Asian Tanzanian, as they're often referred to in Tanzania. He's also a Georgetown alum and on the board of visitors at the business school here. And when I first started taking students to Tanzania, a professor in the business school actually asked me to reach out to him for some research that she needed to follow up on that she had done with his father and grandfather. So I had the opportunity to meet him, such a delightful person. And he and now annually hosts our students, and he likes to regale them with the story of how he ended up in Tanzania and ended up as a member of parliament. And it's a fascinating story, right? His great-grandfather goes, and I actually have let's see if I can get back to my PowerPoint here. Let's see. So it's a fun little imagery here that he has. So this is up in his constituency, which is Singida, which is very much in the central part of Tanzania. And his great-grandfather came originally as a business person, but a fairly poor business person, and started some local shops in the town of Singida. And this story that we'll talk about very soon about sort of Indian business persons and their role in the British colonial structure. But 4 generations later, he's there. He's a fluent Kiswahili speaker, a product of some Tanzanian schools, and in addition to business, decided that he wanted to run for office in his home constituency. He actually did not get the party's endorsement the first time around, but has served in the last 2 terms. So it's an interesting sort of narrative of what we'll be talking about today in terms of Indian Ocean interactions. There's Singida, I just wanted to show you that. So as we'll talk about later, so here's Dar es Salaam, the capital, right? And much of what we're talking about is very much centered on the coast. We tend to think of the interactions of some of the communities as very much a coastal story. But of course, his great-grandfather goes up country and serves as this middleman. And the family, though they have long had a Dar es Salaam home, has this Singida connection, and therefore he runs and wins as a member of parliament in that constituency. He also, their business is a diversified business. They do sort of cooking oil, soda, very important basic products. Important in sort of two senses. One, they're things that people use, rice, these sorts of things that they use for cooking and so on. They also make kangas, these wraps that are very sort of common in the coast. So this is not a kanga that their textile mill made. I strangely don't have any of those. But this is one of my favorites because this is one that was made after Mwalimu Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, died. This was a memorial kanga that was printed, and many Tanzanian women wore shortly after his death, 1999. That I do have, and is kind of a neat example. Kangas, of course, are often political too, so I found my kanga from the Millennium Challenge account, which is the US-based organization, corporation created by, during President George W. Bush's administration for promoting the Millennium Development Goals in a sort of uniquely American way, so promoting private sector development and also moving U.S. development into new fields like roads and energy. So the MCC, as part of their own public relations campaign in Tanzania, printed these kangas and also distributed them. So I didn't see nearly as many women running around with their MCC kangas as I did with their Mwalimu Nyerere kangas. But these are examples of the things that that Mohamed Duji's company produces. They produce them locally, right? So they employ local labor. So the textile mill, actually, he invited our students to visit. It's in a town called Morogoro several years ago. So it's an interesting story. That illustrates an important historical phenomenon that integrates East Africa with the rest of the Indian Ocean world. And I think Ayer really captures this well. Her study is actually of Kenyans, Indians in Kenya, excuse me. But she is making a very distinct argument that says that these, the Indian diaspora in Kenya, and I think this certainly applies to the diaspora in Tanzania as well, maybe Uganda would be a little different, but that this diaspora was never sort of only temporarily in a place like Kenya or Tanzania, but that they created an imaginary that was very much in both places, both in the homeland of India and in the host land. So, for example, you know, in the Kanga story, when we visited his textile mill, the laborers, the workers at all levels, including the design element, are Tanzanians. The one person that's the manager is from this Indian subcontinent, first generation sort of temporary migrant. Because it turns out that India is one of the few places in the world that has specialized training in textile manufacturing, right? That would actually make perfect sense. So this gentleman has that training. He runs this textile mill. Obviously, there's talk of capacity building from the side of the company, whether that's happening. But I think that that's an interesting example. There's an important narrative of sort of, well, these folks who've come really consider themselves to be Indians or consider themselves to be part of the homeland that they came from. And there's a lot of historical work now and some articles that I'd be happy to share at the close of this that point to the fact that even in the 20th century, very early on, we see evidence that these members of these various Indian Ocean communities were very much thinking about host land sorts of identities, so Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda as well. My notes are never good to totally outlib. So I think the themes are not surprising then, right? But what I would want to emphasize in my discussion today is that as important as the histories, and particularly the 20th century history that I'll talk about for a few minutes today, as important as that history is, it's not determinative. There's a modernity to Indian Ocean identities, to the various identities along the East African coast and inland that are very modern and that are very fluid and changing in many ways. And that's why I sort of love Mohamed Duji's story, because he's trying to sort of create a modern image of Asian Tanzanians, as they're called, and that's that's not often sort of emphasized in the historical narrative. At the same time, of course, for most citizens of East Africa, there are these key moments when these sort of symbolic politics of foreigner and local come up that we'll talk about. But for much of, really almost all of the 20th century, the ebbs and flows of human migration along the coast and inland were meeting economic needs for the most part, and did not give cause for concern. And we'll talk about sort of what are the circumstances under which these groups are contested as being part of the lands that they've come to. So as I thought about what I wanted to talk about today, I want to think about how this history has impacted contemporary life in East Africa, and how political and social identities in East Africa are shaped by these long historical interactions, but also how they're being remade, how they're being rethought of, and especially how they illustrate themes that are common to world history. And I think that there are a lot of themes in contemporary political life in East Africa that sort of broadly apply to other themes of world history. An important example of that is the study of race, racial identity, race making, the racial state. And I wanted to share a small clip. Not sure how many, I'm actually sort of curious, how many of you have ever seen The Wonders of the African World, the Henry Louis Gates segment? I'm going to show about 5 minutes of it, but this is Henry Louis Gates, of course, longtime professor of African Americans and African Studies at Harvard University, did a 6-part series called The Wonders of the African World. It accompanies this massive volume on Africana studies. It's fabulous. I think many historians have challenged the historiography that he presents, but it's a great foil for sort of thinking about these things. It was so popular that I suspect you can get it in public libraries. You can get it in the DC Public Library, for example. So if you wanted to show a segment, I think it's really sort of accessible in many ways. So I want to show a quick segment, and then we'll chat more about it. Let's see. All right, show, and I queued it up. Let's see if it works. So just to give a context, he has the Black Kingdoms of the Nile, the Swahili Coast, the Slave Kingdoms, the Holy Land, the Road to Timbuktu, and the Lost Cities of the South. And you know, these year things always get me because it feels like just yesterday that it came out, 2000. So that was just yesterday, right? I actually, in my undergrad, watched Ali Missouri's Africans, the Triple Heritage, right, which I still think is wonderful too. But I suspect that even the cinematography of this, our students will find remarkably old school. This being the Gates thing, which is even newer. But he also tackles it in a different, interesting way. So I'm just going to cue up the beginning of the Swahili Coast and watch about 5 minutes.
I think you turned it off on the other screen.
Yeah.
Minimize.
Thank you. Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Many are now in ruins, but some, with their distinctive Muslim culture, have survived to this day. I began my journey on the island of Lamu, just off northern Kenya. I'll travel south, along the Swahili coast, stopping off at the old ocean port of Mombasa. Finally, I'm sailing to the island of Zanzibar, as I try to untangle the roots of the Swahili people. The most traditional of all the Swahili towns. For 2,000 years, Arab merchants have settled on this coast. You can see their influence everywhere. seems to be a mosque on every street corner. And most children here are educated in Quranic schools. It feels more like the Middle East than Kenya. Yet I'm in the heart of Black Africa. I'm going to see Sheikh Badawi, one of Lamu's most venerable Islamic scholars. Assalamu alaikum. I want to understand the history of Lamu. How Lamu was founded. Is it an Arab civilization or is it an African civilization?
Lamu, in effect, was Arab civilization since more than 1,000 years.
Sheikh Badawi is proud of his Arabic roots. He tells me he can trace his family back to the Prophet Muhammad. You have a noble ancestry. Do you have African ancestors as well?
Sasa sisi hatupendelei kuwa kizazi cha Kiafrika ni kitoevu, lakini mtoi wa Afrika na kizazi chake na kizazi chake, lakini sasa
all his ancestors are coming from Arab people. And in the past, there was a system of making concubines.
Concubines?
Yeah. Marrying those women.
Yes.
So it resulted people to be considered as inferior.
And the concubines were African women?
Yeah, concubines.
I see. Why did Arab men take African women as concubines?
Maybe people could not afford to marry many Arab people. So the Africans or the local people were cheap. And other reasons best known to them.
Whatever Sheikh Badawi says, that supposedly pure Arabic blood has long been mixed with the blood of black Africans. Historians say that Swahili culture was shaped by the monsoon trade winds. Arabs came here to trade with Africans. They had to wait 6 months for the winds to change before they could sail home. They took concubines, wives, and had children. One village still specializes in building dhows. The boats sailed for centuries by Swahili merchants. Today, everyone's on the beach, helping to launch a new dhow. Traditionally, it's the captain, not the boat, who's launched into the water first.
kofia yako. Oh.
Yeah, probably fast. Yeah, that's great. Collect your luck. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Kofia! Kofia! Okay. You okay? Yeah. You okay? Yeah, thank you.
The Indian Ocean trade has long defined Swahili life. Africans and Arabs traded riches from the interior for the luxuries of the East. Ahmad Sagaf is an architect whose family has lived in Lamu for generations. Like Sheikh Badawi, he traces his ancestry back to Arabia. Now, your ancestors came here in the 13th century. Did they mix with the Africans?
Yeah, because they can't live by themselves. They have to mix with the people, so as to manage their stay in Kenya.
So African men could marry Arab women?
Very rare, in the very rare case.
Very rare.
But an Arab man can easily marry an African woman.
So the Arab men intermarried with African women, and they created the Swahili people?
Yeah, this is how the path of the Swahili language and culture came about.
So you can trace your ancestry back to the 13th
Yeah, I have a tree structure of our families.
A family tree?
Yeah, from Prophet Muhammad up to my sons.
You do?
Yes.
Wow, that's great. Huh. But can Africans trace their ancestry back that far?
Not mostly, because most of them are illiterate.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to keep the records. This was the main problem with those people.
If you lived in the States, you would be called a black man. You're not black here.
Here I'm not black, because most of the people, they recognize me as a local Arab.
Right, look around.
Yeah.
Does it give you greater social standing here?
Yes, very much. Yes, because I can now identify myself as somebody else from other clan or from other families.
Other clans, other families.
Other families. That is the most important of keeping up all these records of the family tree structure.
And you know what? It's exactly the same in my country. Everybody wants to be from elsewhere.
Well, you can see that it's a fun video to watch. I was testing it last night with my 6 and 8 year olds, and they thought the launching of the captain was also hysterical. So it does help. There's a few interesting features, and perhaps we'll have time at the end, either today or this afternoon, to talk about sort of the role of sources like this. It's interesting, right? Because Professor Gates says. It feels more like I'm in the Middle East than Kenya, right? Or yet I'm in the heart of Black Africa. So in some ways, of course, from a historiographical perspective, missing some of the sort of key elements or glossing them over, undoubtedly, for a popular audience. Yet I think for our students and for many folks, this could be an accessible sort of hook into thinking about Indian Ocean identities in the contemporary period, right? Because we sort of immediately recognize the American racial narrative in the context of the uniqueness of plantation slavery in the United States, the uniqueness of institutional and legal parameters like the one-drop rule, right, that Gates is referencing in terms of who is a black person in what context. But in East Africa, of course, the complexity is equally there, but in a very different way. And so part of what we see in terms of contemporary identities in East Africa is an overlap of many of these sorts of features of identities, right? So at various points, for example, when religious communities feel under attack, then religion becomes the important source of identity. And we see this very much in Kenya, where Muslim communities feel that the government overly privileges Christians, for example, and has historically. And there you see Muslims of different racial and ethnic backgrounds perhaps coming together and coalescing at a particular time around a religious identity. But other times, there may be many other issues that come to the fore. Land, as we'll talk about in a second, and occupational history. Who's occupied that particular territory for the longest at a particular time may come into force. And so this sort of contrast of the American experience of racial history or understandings of racial history with an East African one provides a way of sort of enlivening world history, right? And sort of helping both ourselves and our students think about our own racial history, but also really complexifying the contexts that are quite different. So for example, a notion of a one-drop rule does not apply in East Africa. It is not how racial categories were ever determined legally or institutionally or even culturally. So I want to give a few examples of some of the terms and identities that are at play that even play out in this tiny little 8-minute film clip that don't always get sort of highlighted. So some of the common terms for ethno-racial groups in East Africa, and they're different in different countries. So as I've said before, in Tanzania, those of South Asian and Middle Eastern descent are often referred to as Asian Tanzanians, particularly those from the racially and phenotypically and historically from the Indian subcontinent would be called Asian Tanzanians. In Kenya, they would be called Indian Kenyans, generally speaking, as well as Indian Ugandans, for example. Shirazi, and there's later in the Swahili coast, just at the end, there's a little clip where Professor Gates goes to Zanzibar and meets with some gentlemen as well. I forget if they're teachers. Anyway, they also people that have sort of been carefully selected, and they self-identify as Persian, and in Zanzibar that's referred to as Shirazi. Historically, Shirazi people trace their descent to Persians. Phenotypically, if you're using an American gloss, right, you and I probably would say, and your students might say, they're black. And what's really great in that clip is that Professor Gates says, if you were in America, do you know you would be considered black? And they say, yes, they understand that part of American history, right? But they're telling him, actually, in Zanzibar and Tanzania, we identify and are identified as Shirazi of Persian descent. But other times, different groupings sort of coalesce, so there's sometimes reference to coastal peoples, for example, that comes up almost at every election cycle, particularly in Kenya, for example, so a kind of conglomeration of the various ethno-racial groups that are along the coast. As Professor Gates, see if...
Is coastal people like more of an occupational kind of a identifier?
Right. No, it's not. So it's more of this, and that's why I want to pull up this slide. Okay. So these are some Kiswahili terms that are used in the two countries. Of course, both countries have a history of Kiswahili as a national language, but in tremendously different ways. So it's very much a national language spoken by nearly 100% of Tanzanians, mostly because of the policy of the first president, Nyerere. In Kenya, it's much more of English has come to dominate for a variety of reasons. So many Kenyans will speak their mother tongue first, some Kiswahili because they have to learn it in school, and then some English, and so it varies. Nonetheless, the terms used for different groups are often expressed in Kiswahili, so it can be useful to sort of see them in that and then think about how they translate. So yes, in Kenya, for example, so I'm using in that earlier slide, coastal people to refer to the collection, the constellation of groups along the coast that's usually glossed in English as coastal people, if it's, say, in an English language newspaper as the coastal people. In Kiswahili, that might refer to Wanyika, as Professor Prestholt points out in a really interesting article about coastal Kenya's history right on the eve of independence, and I'll share that article with you. It's a great one. That I just had not seen before preparing for this talk, so thanks for the opportunity. But he points out some of the different terms that are used. He groups the first three, Wanyeji, Wanyenwe, and Wamiji, as roughly Arab identities along the coast. Arab, again in quotes, right? Self-identified folks of Arab descent. That may or may not look phenotypically Arab or black or white or anything else, but identify as Arab. And as the interviewees in the Professor Gates segment point out, there were a number of historical privileges accorded to those individuals, going back centuries, up to and including through the colonial, the late colonial period. And so they tended to be urban, for example. They tended to own small businesses, for example. Wanika, or coastal people, could refer to the constellation of those who came as far as the coast from inland and did not take that slave journey in the Indian Ocean slave trade. And there are a variety of reasons, of course, and you've probably already discussed this, for how and why folks get as far as the coast and end up staying there. We can talk more about that. But they don't have to be. I mean, upcountry folks in Kenya and Tanzania may not have come, they may have come in later waves of migration. So during periods of drought, the 1930s was one that came up in some of the readings. That was a key sort of drought period when a variety of folks from the upcountry, as it's called, come to the coast seeking economic opportunity, escaping the drought, and come to have this constellation of Wanika. Whereas in Tanzania, the terms are slightly different. So under Nyerere's African socialism, as it was called, citizens were Wananchi, and that was meant to refer to every Tanzanian. So Nyerere had a very clear policy, as I'll talk about in a moment, of sort of trying to downplay or diminish the various differences between ethnic groups and language and religious groups in Tanzania. But in the later period, by the 90s, politicians and leaders were not using the term Wananchi, but Wazawa, to refer to indigenous Africans, as opposed to other categories, Indians or Asians, Wapemba, because of course Zanzibar is actually two islands. The bigger island is Unguja, and Pemba is the smaller island. So Wa is the prefix for plural humans, so Wapemba are people of Pemba, Wa Zanzibari are the people of the two islands of Zanzibar, and so on. So the key thing is that the terms shift and change, they have a fluidity, but they also reflect tremendous sort of power. And it always reminds me of the amazing work of Stuart Hall, the British sociologist of Caribbean descent, who talks so much about how as much as institutionalized and structural inequality through racism is so crucial and we have to study it, race is, it's real, right? It's part of the stories that we tell about our identities. And I love the Gates piece because you hear his story and you hear the folks on the coast sort of articulating their narratives of racial identity. And of course, Stuart Hall's later work really pointed out the historical construction of these racial stories and how they change over time, particularly, he was writing in the UK and in Western Europe. But in some senses, the story of race in the world is a global story. It's part of the history. It's part of world history in that sense. So I want to have just a couple of comments about the impact of colonial rule in East Africa on some of these identities, because I'm not sure how far into that you got. So I'll say a few things and then we can talk more about it. The key impact of British colonial rule in the 20th century on these sort of Indian Ocean migrations was both the importation of labor that I'll talk about in a second, and the structures of legalized and institutionalized racial hierarchy and racism. Europeans built and strictly enforced various forms of racial segregation in their colonies, and that included strict residential segregation, strict to the extent that there was any voting rights or legislative roles. Those were always what they called communal voting roles, right? So Indian Kenyans could vote for a seat for an Indian Kenyan, but they were not participating in a broader Kenyan election. And those votes were accorded even before African votes were, for example. And key to this, and this gets back to the land question that we'll talk about in a second, is that land, the most fertile land, was reserved for Europeans, and Africans were increasingly pushed into smaller tracts of land, considerably less fertile land over time, as particularly Kenyan settler colonialism developed. More and more settlers came and built these farms. So Africans themselves were also pushed into various ethnically defined regions. So happy to talk or think more about this, but I'm focusing somewhat on the coastal identities, but a rich and important literature on those various groups and how they were placed in their own ethnically defined regions and the impact of that. Native authority, for those of you who've thought about this and how you'll teach it, of course, being the British system of indirect rule, the system of either using or more frequently establishing a local chief that would enforce British taxes primarily, right, and British law, and the chief would also control various aspects of communal life, so marriage, inheritance, property were generally delegated to chiefs within designated regions, so long as labor and taxes were received by the colonial authority. All of this had a huge impact on coastal folks as well as new migrants. So Indians, for example, were prohibited from working in agriculture. And so this phenomenon at independence where Indian, and we think of it most evocatively in Uganda, and I'll talk about it in a second, where there was this anti-Indian sentiment because Indians were these business people who controlled so much. That was in fact very much an explicit creation of British law, that Indians were prohibited from not only agriculture, but even from residing in these areas unless they were traders or building commercial outposts and so on. So that colonial history then played a role, of course, at decolonization. And decolonization itself created, as Prestholt points out, a really uniquely complicated situation for the various groups that came from this Indian Ocean diaspora. Because where did they fit in the soon-to-be independent Kenyas, Ugandas, and Tanzanias in particular, was a question that they needed to ask and answer, and that definitely fellow citizens in those three countries in particular were attempting to answer. So, for example, following on from Native Authority and then through the so-called emergency during the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, the colonial government was only allowing organization through ethnic or racial association. So again, Arabs, Indians on the coast, as well as Kikuyus, Luos, Kalenjins upcountry, various groups like that, Sukuma in Tanzania, were only allowed to organize through ethnic and racial groupings. And so the creation of pan-ethnic or pan-racial political consciousness was very much a resistance to the colonial project, right? It had to come out of resisting the racial hierarchy and the racism of the colonial system. In Kenya, that led, and that's what I think you see in the video so nicely, this unique constellation of even distinct from Indian Kenyans, those from the Indian subcontinent historically, but this Arabized set of Swahili communities, this mixed Swahili means different things to different people, but is often glossed as an ethnic group as a sort of mixed ancestry, right? So folks who are the product of upcountry African ethnic groups and Arab traders primarily, intermarrying in the ways that our sources talked about. And at independence, those groups felt very insecure. Were they part of Kenya? They, of course, had been ruled as part of the Republic of Zanzibar by the Sultan during this time. And so they actually sought to create their own protectorate, which would be from Lamu in Kenya all the way down to the Tanganyikan border, Tanzania. Tanganyika is the word for just the mainland, excluding Zanzibar. And this effort to create kind of a separate political identity, even to secede, gained momentum in the 1950s. The reason this is important is that in every election cycle, and you will see this if you're teaching this during the next election cycle in Kenya, and definitely in Tanzania as well. Tanzania will hold elections in October of this year. You will see that Zanzibar and the coast, these are places where violence, inter-ethnic violence, you might read in the New York Times there are ethnic clashes, but this is not a group of people who sort of periodically, for no particular reason, like to rise up against each other. This is that sort of tension between the Wanyika, the upcountry folks, and the various groups along these coastal communities, and how they sort of see themselves in the political sphere. So, and a separate category within that, as we've already discussed, then are Asian or Indian Tanzanians. I always use these things in quotes because they mean something specific in these specific places. So an Asian Tanzanian generally means an individual who's come from the Indian subcontinent, usually in the 20th century. And some sort of interesting statistics about the number of Indians who dispersed in an incredibly short period of time. Most of these traveled as indentured servants, and most returned to India upon the completion of their indenture. But a sizable number did not. So, for example, 40,000 or so, mostly Punjabi Indians, came to build the Kenya-Uganda Railroad, which is a beautiful railroad, which I have driven on myself and enjoyed. But it was a huge infrastructure project, and 40,000 Indians came. Ayer says about a fifth stayed in Kenya after the termination of their contracts. So some smaller number of the original former indentured servants stay. But then what I think is so interesting, and I actually haven't seen these numbers in quite this way, is the tremendous influx of Indians after that period. So we often sort of think of Indians in Kenya and Tanzania as coming from the earliest period of the British Empire, being brought by the British Empire as these sort of middlemen minority. But in point of fact, many came later voluntarily, generally seeking economic opportunities, and often encouraged by the British government, but not as indentured servants, which I think is an important point to make.
Why didn't the British use local labor?
Right? So the most important tactic of British colonial rule, in some ways they did it even better than the French or the Portuguese, was divide and rule. And so that was key to the 40 or so ethnic groups of Kenya and the 120 or so ethnic groups in Tanzania. You don't want cross-ethnic or cross-racial organizing, right? Because then you'll get people who want to overthrow you, as they did once they established pan-ethnic and pan-racial organizing, which definitely happened very early on. The first, and I would argue the most important reason, is a specific political strategy of how to create an empire. Certainly it is the case that because the British had been in India longer, there were higher rates of literacy and numeracy in India, and if you want to bring in already trained folks for these sort of middle-level positions. So what starts to happen, and I think I have more about that. So what starts to happen early in the 20th century, after these periods of indenture and after the railway is built, is that you get a variety of folks who come in. Some of the former indentured servants take on sort of semi-skilled important labor as mechanics and masons and builders, but others that are coming in this later wave, not as indentured servants, but through that 1900 to 1930 period, are recruited voluntarily to work in low to mid-level civil service positions in the British Empire, British colonial government in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But also education, so many of the head teachers by the 1930s in the best schools for Kenyans and Tanzanians were Indian head teachers. And then certainly this encouragement of trade, going back to what I was saying before. So the theory of the strategy of indirect rule was certainly divide and rule, but it was also minimize your costs. So unlike the French sort of model of bringing in a fairly large but short-term colonial infrastructure, the British system, everybody was sort of trying out their models. Luckily, none of them worked, but they were somewhat stylistically different. There are some overlaps on, I'm simplifying, but indirect rule was a model of sort of having relatively limited colonial administration. There were lots of settlers, but those were private farmers, private business people going to develop coffee, tea, cotton plantations in these fertile highlands, particularly in Kenya, but also in Tanzania and Uganda. But within the colonial service, then there was often this set of middlemen, and that included in business. So there was, and this is Mo Duji's story, that's why I think it's such a great example, and he loves to share it so willingly, so I feel comfortable sharing it with you. That this grandfather gets sort of you get in almost every tiny little town in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda at some point, the shops in the main center of town are run by Indians. and they're facilitating the trade. And so the statistic, I think I may have skipped over it, or where is it? There's a really nice, oh, here it is. By 1910, in Kenya, 85% of the internal trade is controlled by Indian Kenyans, already by 1910. So by 1910, Indians were controlling 85% of the internal trade inside Kenya. So again, that was very much within the infrastructure of indirect rule. And the other important thing that, this isn't my African politics class, so but it will come up, I'm sure, with your students, and it's interesting to think about, right? Not only do African ethnic communities get pushed off the best land and into smaller plots of land and less fertile, but they now have to pay taxes, right? Hut taxes and cattle taxes for the most part. And the purpose of that was to create labor, right? Because Africans didn't want to work on the plantations. Why would they want to, right? They had been small-scale farmers or fishermen or whatever for so long. So to create the demand, you create a tax that has to be paid for in cash. Now some member of the family has to go and work in wage labor. But you also bring in a shopkeeper, right, who's got some goods that you've never seen before, some of which may be very helpful, right? Clothing that lasts longer, sugar, salt, things that were much more difficult to come across. So it's all part of sort of how the demand side of the colonial economy gets created. And Indian Kenyans and Asian Tanzanians and Indian Ugandans play sort of a central role in that. But what's interesting, and the Iyer article does such a nice job, so I hope you'll get to look at it, is that she argues that by the 1930s, Indian Kenyans were identifying common cause with other Kenyans, trying to create a pan-Kenyan, pan-racial, pan-ethnic set of political platforms. Part of what complicated that, and I'll come back in a second to the earlier slide, part of what complicated that, as she points out, is that Indian Kenyans and to a lesser extent Indian Tanzanians were very concerned with labor issues. So they tended to be forming labor unions earlier, and they were working in industries that could be unionized, right? Masons, small-scale traders, and so on. The key political concern for most African ethnic communities, the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Kalenjin, the big ones in Kenya, was land, right? What's called land hunger. And so part of what made cross-racial organizing difficult in the early 20th century was not that groups didn't want to make common cause. There was already these various laws that were physically dividing these groups, and certainly in terms of privilege, very much socioeconomically dividing them. But in addition, the political concerns they wanted to put forward were different. And so there was a real complicated process in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s as groups tried to sort of broaden and include different voices. And it wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always perfect, but over time, I think I think it's reasonable to say that this kind of organizing did in fact happen, and did in fact reflect a sense of homeland by these various diaspora communities, either Arab and Swahili coastal folks, or Indian and Asian communities. Post-independence, these things became difficult in a different way, right? So after the waves of independence, basically by 1965, what you have then is you have a huge pressure for the first generation of African presidents in these countries, but really across the continent, to answer these questions of land hunger, of educational opportunity. And an easy and quick, symbolic but practical way as well to do that was various forms of indigenization programs. And so they happened really across all of East Africa in slightly different ways. They were called different things in different places. But the slogan was Africa for Africans, right? The sort of quintessential version of this is Mobutu in Zaire, right? Who changes his name and dons different clothing and sort of pushes forward this agenda. But it certainly happened in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda as well. So this came in the form of restrictions, quotas, or complete whole-scale firing of all Indian or Asian individuals in the civil service, replacement of head teachers and other teachers of Indians or Asians by Black Africans at that point. and definitely intense efforts at changing the dynamic around business, sort of flipping this 85% of trade being dominated by Indians in Kenya, for example. And so there were waves of expropriation of buildings and so on. So for example, as another interesting statistic, at the time of the 1971 ordinance, which expropriated all buildings, 97% of the buildings that were nationalized, so that there were other buildings that a huge block of large buildings was nationalized, taken over by the Tanzanian government, but 97% of those buildings belonged to Asian Tanzanians. So again, you sort of see the tremendous dominance in particular sectors. And there was great domestic support for those moves by other communities within Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda who were seeking equity. But it certainly challenged this dynamic of the cross-racial, pan-racial formation. Yes, please.
I was just thinking as you were on the slide where you talked about the fact that Indians were brought in and were head teachers in the schools. There's a really interesting book by Heather Sharkey in which she talks about boarding college and as a platform for nationalism. Did something like that happen with those Indian well-educated people? Because you mentioned,
I haven't read that book, so I've read
sort of it's sort of the teachers of Arabic, teachers of English, in fact, brought in and introduced indigenous people to literatures and to nationalistic ideas and sort of pan-Arab and so on and so forth. All sorts of what do you call it? Like a witch's brew of things that the British didn't want, of unintended consequences from the education system that was designed to educate civil servants.
Right.
So did that happen?
I haven't seen any
East
evidence
Africa?
of that, so I need to look at the Heather Sharkey thing and sort of think about that. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely these teachers' colleges and even high schools were breeding grounds for anti-colonial sentiment, right? So if you, mostly men, if you were a man who managed to get to one of these very elite boarding schools, for Kenyans, for Tanzanians, for Ugandans, once you got there by the 1920s and 30s, right, you were already beginning to think about these things. I don't know if the schools were the breeding ground. Asana Iyer's work is definitely arguing that that Indian Kenyans were informed by the anti-colonial sentiment in India, right? I mean, the argument has been that Indian Kenyans were just concerned about the anti-colonial movement in India, via Nepal. I mean, very famous sort of people have argued that, I traveled to Kenya and the Indian Kenyans are this sort of insular group of Indians who don't think of themselves as Kenyans, and certainly the historical narrative had been that they were mostly concerned with, engaged with the anti-colonial sentiment in India. Iyer is arguing explicitly, though she doesn't look at it through educational institutions, she's looking at it specifically through sort of trade union organizing and so on. So it's an empirical question we can ask about whether those places were spaces. But she's definitely arguing that Indian Kenyans were using their anti-British colonial sentiments in India to inform an anti-colonial and support an anti-colonial sentiment inside Kenya. And that was happening in cross-racial, cross-ethnic ways. But the British rule was all about blocking that, right? And it wasn't just about blocking Indians and Africans, it was about blocking Africans with other communities and creating common cause.
But as you know, a teacher in his or her classroom can do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
and teaching Shakespeare or teaching whatever they were teaching.
Yep, and I think we could. Yeah, I just can't answer it empirically whether it's been done, but it's great. And I love Heather Sharkey's other work.
Sharkey's book is really good.
I will look at it. Yeah, she's so good for thinking about Sudan and racial identity formation and language in all of this, right? So certainly that's true. I'm thinking back to sort of some of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, if anybody's ever read Ngugi. He's wonderful. So, and I can write it somewhere, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o is sort of the Chinua Achebe of Kenya. They had a famous sort of debate in the 1980s, I think the early 80s. Ngugi's still alive. He teaches at UC Irvine. He's the director of a research and translation institute. He has a number of novels that I absolutely adore, but he also has a memoir of his life called, it's not just a memoir, it's a political treatise called The Decolonization of the Mind. And he has a rich discussion of his own education that I wonder if it touches on that, if he talks about this. But it's certainly true that across East Africa, I mean, what's interesting is that in the modern period, as I'll say something about in a quick second, there are a lot of Indian teachers coming back to East Africa, but often if you meet folks from the 1950s and 1960s, they will tell you, I had so-and-so, they'll remember their name, this Indian teacher who taught me at my boys' boarding school and wherever, I mean, all the first presidents and so on. So undoubtedly this played a role. It's just, I don't know for sure if that's the hotbed of it. A couple things, and then I'll get to the contemporary part so that we can finish up. I think the argument is important in all of this is to say that as much as there were these often successful attempts at pan-ethnic, pan-racial organizing, pan-national organizing, if you will, there are some pressure points in this. One I've already mentioned, which is this tension between what many African communities were concerned about, particularly around land, but other issues as well. And taxes, high taxes, and concerns around maybe labor or other kinds of institutional protections, right? So as the first round of constitutions were written, but even in the newer round, Kenya just rewrote entirely its constitution in 2010. Tanzania is in the midst of an extremely contentious constitutional revision process that's been going on ad infinitum for several years now. One of the biggest sets of contentious issues within that are these sorts of institutional protections that may be granted. So in Kenya, the Qadi courts, which would be courts of Islamic customary law, there were a contingency within Kenya that did not want those to be protected courts, that wanted only a civil court system, and these were significant concerns for coastal communities, for example. Obviously, I include marriage twice on purpose because some would say it's an institutional question, right? Sort of who can marry someone? Must it be only a civil servant? But this is also about cultural protection, about how communities define marriage as a relationship as well. So the post-independence period was difficult. Generally speaking, I would argue that there are sort of three sort of circumstances which put pressure on interethnic and interracial identities in East Africa. The first is economic pressure, and there's a great article that I'll make sure to put up by Ron Amanzadeh about Tanzania, and he basically argues that in the 1990s, structural adjustment, which you've probably all heard about, various World Bank, IMF economic reforms, austerity reforms, put great pressure on the Tanzanian government, and then you see all this anti-Asian rhetoric, right, that sort of flares up seemingly out of nowhere. And so economic pressure, economic downturns are a time when these sorts of intergroup conflicts come up. Certainly conflict and war. The earlier slide had the somewhat iconic evictions of Asians from Uganda. In point of fact, there's a great study by Clara Dita, a new one, that looks at what she calls mass expulsions in Africa, all of Africa. And in fact, Uganda scores very low, but it's sort of interesting because we generally think of this evocative and an important case where Idi Amin literally overnight said all Asian Ugandans needed to leave, and yet arguably that really was less about Asian Ugandans or Indian Ugandans and more about Idi Amin as a dictator. And in point of fact, the numbers vary, but probably around 100,000 or more Ugandans lost their life in political violence in that same time period. So the eviction of Asian Ugandans was very much a kind of ploy of an increasingly autocratic Idi Amin, rather than somewhat only or even primarily about sort of those identity groups. So economic pressure, conflict and war are other reasons. And then finally election cycles. I've alluded to this several times. And I think it's important to point out that basically every time there's an election in these countries, and since we had our first debate of the season last night, it's a good time to be a bit humbled about this, right? All sorts of political rhetoric gets pulled out in election cycles. And pretty much every time there's an election in Kenya or Tanzania, for sure, questions of Arabs, Shirazi, Zanzibari independence, Mijikenda, Waneka, various identity groups, Indian Kenyans, come up as either we're going to do a better job for you, or you really don't, you have too much privilege already, we need to hamper that. And that's very much about the ebbs and flows of domestic politics, and we certainly do see that. And this sort of summarizes the argument that I was making before that Iyer has, that Indian politics was really in two milieus, the homeland and the host land. And I think that really applies across this broad region of East Africa that we might talk about in really interesting ways. So just to wrap up, I have a few things to say about sort of contemporary migration, but happy either this morning or this afternoon to talk more about this history. I always say to my students in my African politics classes, I'll do a couple of sessions on sort of 19th and 20th century African history, and I'll refer them to my colleagues who teach African history here, and I'll say I'm about to do violence to centuries of African history if I summarize it. So some of the things I've said about British colonialism are this massive summarization of a really complicated history. So if we need to go back to it, we should. Contemporary migration patterns in the region are really quite different. So we certainly do see travel and influence of folks from what is now the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent for sure. But there are other kinds of migration patterns that are becoming important, both voluntary and forced migration. So for example, the latest report that I could find was a UNHCR report from Yemen. Yemen hosts about 600,000 what they call people of concern. And as you can see, a sizable number of these folks are from the Horn of Africa, from East Africa. So the Indian Ocean movements continue, though the pushes and pulls may be different. In this case, I think arguably there's both a push and a pull. The pull is the labor needs in the Gulf states and the Arabian Peninsula that have pulled some sizable amount of male construction workers and other kinds of workers, although those have generally come from other parts of Asia, West Africa. Huge push for domestic workers, and those are almost all female. So I have been searching for a long time for a good estimate of how many Ethiopians and Eritreans work in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf, and I've never seen a good number. Just as an example, about 2 years ago, Saudi Arabia, there was an incident between Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. They expelled, within a month, 50,000 what they called illegal Ethiopians from Ethiopia. They would literally fill up plane loads and dump them in Addis Ababa. It became kind of an international incident. So if 50,000 are considered illegal, I think there's probably hundreds of thousands of young women, primarily, almost exclusively, in the Middle East, working primarily as domestic workers in homes and families. That could be argued to be voluntary labor migration, although the conditions under which they work, Human Rights Watch has done some great work on this, the voluntariness of it almost leaves as soon as they leave the airport, because often their passports and documents are taken away, they're tied to a particular family. So they're very complicated labor relations between these two countries. But there is certainly some sizable voluntary labor migration as well as a sizable forced migration. That seems to have decreased, not surprisingly, as Yemen is at its, so I mean the peak was 2012 as I see it, of folks going to Yemen in this forced migration, these waves of Ethiopians, Eritreans, and Somalis. Taking small boats, because as you saw in that first map, it's just a tiny little strip of water to get to Yemen. Obviously not seeking to stay in Yemen, seeking, as others in Europe, as we've been hearing about in the last few weeks, seeking to transit through Yemen, either up to the Middle East for economic opportunity or elsewhere. So that migration continues. It's also difficult, and this is one of the events that we hope to host between African Studies and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, looking at Eritreans who are facing a very difficult situations inside Eritrea, and many of whom have left via either the Sinai and Sudan to try to get either to Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East, to Europe. And unfortunately, Egypt's political troubles have really caught them in a very difficult situation. So there's been some significant numbers of Eritreans that have been kidnapped, is the word, thinking piracy, that have been kidnapped for ransom. And there's a beautiful film that we're hoping to show that features an Eritrean woman in Sweden who has highlighted some of these issues. But the question of forced migration is a huge one for the contemporary Indian Ocean community. Yes, please, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I experienced this, I went through Lebanon, We always
Yes.
have a worker
Uh-huh.
in the house.
Yeah.
But, yeah, typically
Who was from where? Did you?
Ethiopian,
Ethiopian, yeah.
usually.
Mhm, yeah.
Some homes have, actually Southeast Asian women
Yeah.
too, but
Yeah.
the majority are
Yeah.
Ethiopian. But they're paid for ahead of time,
Mhm.
you know, in terms of like the family goes to like some agency.
Indeed.
And they,
Mhm.
you know, they find somebody
Mhm.
and their airfare is paid for, and
Yeah.
they're paid for like a year, usually 2-year contract. And it's very funny because my mother-in-law is always in the house, but if
Yeah.
she leaves, you know, the girl lives with her often. I mean, she's part of the family, you know, she
Yeah.
plays with my children, and there's been like 3 or 4 of them since I've been there, because some of them do like run away.
Indeed.
And they run away because, not because it's a bad situation in the house, but if they can find
Yeah.
private work
Yeah.
someplace else, they end up making more money, but, you know, we like lock the doors so she can't get out. They do hold her passport.
Yeah.
You know, it's there. It's
Yeah.
not like, you know, she can't go home if she doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Some of the families, you know, they have such good relationships that, you know, their families like do go back and they visit their families and
Indeed.
come back, but the money they can make there
Yeah.
is better, but then same,
Yeah.
I mean,
It's-
it's hard to,
It's such, and I appreciate that personal story. And I too, on the Ethiopia side, I mean, I meet folks through family networks and friends who are on the other side. Some of whom have had really good experiences and come back annually or every other couple of years. They may be single mothers often. I mean, in the best case scenario, this is sort of economic independence for vulnerable communities in poor countries, right? It's very difficult for young women in particular in Ethiopia. That's a highly hierarchical sort of age-focused society and definitely patriarchal society. Young women are sort of the last ones on the totem pole. So this has led to a huge explosion of young women having access to economic opportunity. Unfortunately, there's a great variation in the legal parameters and social conditions in which these individuals work in the Middle Eastern context primarily. And so the variation between domestic laws in an Oman or a Qatar and Lebanon
it's
are
very
play a
different
role.
between homes and,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the girls
Even
share
within the
stories,
same
they go to
country.
like churches they do go to church on
They do,
Saturday
yeah,
and come,
yeah.
and they hear stories of, you know, different situations.
Other people with more
which
difficult
aren't as-
situations. Yeah. There's a great push inside Ethiopia, and I think this is exciting, and I'm actually working on a paper with one of my students about this, to try to look at the sending country legal parameters, right? So if we can't reform what the law is in Lebanon or Oman, can we reform that? Because it's also an agency in the sending country. There's an agency in the receiving country, and there's an agency in the sending country that's supposed to screen and make sure that individuals are fully briefed on their rights and responsibilities. They know what their job description is. Those things haven't really been happening, and so that the push has also been on the sending countries like Ethiopia in particular. You know, this works for Ethiopia because you have a sort of legitimate regime. In an Eritrea or Somalia, folks are leaving on their own, right? It's not about a sending country or an agency. So there are different sending conditions. But yeah, I mean, we may want to come back to this, and this is something that I think brings us sort of full circle in the Indian Ocean migration patterns. They go on. They're different now in some ways than they were, right? So in 2015, we're not necessarily talking about you know. But we are also. I mean, it's funny because I was about to say we're not talking about Indians from the subcontinent coming to work, but in fact we are. And the other article I asked you to read, and there's a second one that I found and will share, focus on India's role in Africa in general, but certainly that network in East Africa being so vibrant and being something. So the Indian government has even designated. Did I put it up here? I can't remember if I did. Let's see. Yeah, it's back here. There's even an official policy which refers to people of Indian origin, and a policy to try to use these folks to help deepen economic ties between India in particular and countries that have sizable Indian diasporas in them. So certainly Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia being one of them. The Indian government, I'm citing a scholar who cites this source, so it's an interesting source. They surveyed people of Indian origin in 2006 and found that about half of them had taken on the nationality, the passport of the country that they were in. So that's, depending on what you thought it was before, that might be more or less than you would expect. But it's interesting sort of data that I hadn't seen elsewhere. But I think it's interesting to point out that in addition to the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Middle East migrations, there are these ongoing and very modern kinds of relationships between primarily India, but also Pakistan and other parts of the Indian subcontinent and African countries. So there's even more kind of technical institutes that I couldn't list on this slide because it wasn't important. But there are a variety of them that are meant to build up capacity in sub-Saharan African countries. And there's a great interest in that, a feeling that Indian technical assistance is maybe more relevant to African contexts than, say, Americans might send in a Peace Corps for HIV/AIDS, for English education, right? But maybe people really want to learn basic IT, maybe they want to learn this textile trade that I'm talking about, other kinds of technical degrees, MBAs, for example, clearly interesting. So you do increasingly see, at Addis Ababa University where I taught, in a department of probably 15 or 18 professors, there's a couple of professors who are from India teaching in the political science department as they try to build a PhD in political science and try to build a kind of premier institute, just as a kind of anecdotal example. And they're more permanently based there. We Americans, we come in for a month, 6 months, a year. They're there for several years, and often have even historical roots, having ancestors, family members who've come to these places before. So there's a different kind of connection than that sort of short-term Western aid, and so it's often received differently. The last thing is, and again, data, I can never find what I want. It's hard to find. Anecdotally, I have to say, I first went to Kenya in '97, and I started in Ethiopia in 2001, and you just I never even heard of people going to India. Partly there wasn't a middle class that had any money for a trip like this. And so that's partly about the fact that Kenya has about a 6 to an 8% GDP growth rate for the last few years. Ethiopia, 8 to 10, depending on who's counting. That's huge, right? A 10% GDP growth rate sustained over several years. So, Kenya is a wealthier country to begin with. Kenya has just actually reached, middle income status. So Kenya is really in a whole different bracket. Tanzania and Ethiopia is still in the lower income bracket. But with those kind of growth rates, you see the growth of the middle class, and where do they go when they want the kinds of medical treatments that they can't get in their own country? Some of them, Ethiopians are actually traveling to Kenya, so Kenya is trying to build a kind of Indian model for other Africans, and it's working, it's great. I know someone personally who had cancer, and there was literally the whole country of Ethiopia, there's no radiation therapy for that kind of cancer, but was able to go to Nairobi, get it for a lot by Ethiopian standards, dirt cheap, if I were to do the conversion from Washington, D.C. And Kenyans are going to India. In fact, last time I was in Kenya in February, I heard, and I was looking for this source today, but I couldn't find it, but I heard anecdotally, so don't quote me, but I suspect it's true, that there was discussion in the Ministry of Health about telling government workers that they couldn't go to India for medical treatment. They had to get it in Kenya, right? Because they're trying to build the Nairobi General and these sort of places that say they have this. And then famously, the Minister of Health, I won't say who he is, but he's the father of someone famous, apparently sent a family member to India for medical treatment. That was the word on the street, and it was a big scandal. Kenyans love scandal, political scandal. It's kind of an art form. We do. Ethiopians don't joke about it quite the way Kenyans do. So I always appreciate the way Kenyans can laugh about a scandal like this. But in any event, these really changing notions of movement, right, around healthcare, around training, and around labor, that I think reflect and illustrate that the modernity of the Indian Ocean kind of relationships that are ongoing and really vibrant. And I think you got an article passed around to you, I hope, called Building Afro-America, slightly unrelated, but someone just sent it to me yesterday and it was so fun. It's an Economist article about America's fastest growing migrant group, which are Africans writ large. Of course, our own Washington, D.C., featuring prominently Ethiopians and Eritreans, but other major hubs of African immigrants. So, of course, the Indian Ocean connections and then the global connections of Africans on the move, as we like to say. So thank you for your patience. I look forward to your questions and comments. Yes, please.
On one of your slides, you referenced South trade.
Yeah.
Can you explain that, please?
Love to, yeah. I think Zachariah Mempili makes this argument in the brief article on India's sojourn to Africa, and the other article I'll put up, Ian Taylor talks about this. Part of the argument, so South-South trade is about poor countries or the global South trading with the global South. So this is the BRICS, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, creating these development banks, trying to, really circumvent and undermine in a kind of competitive global capitalism sort of way, the international financial institutions of the World Bank and the IMF that have been dominated as post-World War II institutions by the United States and Western Europe. And so South-South cooperation is a movement that, Mampili, I think, is absolutely right. He points out that this is, the argument is India is competing with China, and I think he's right to say that that's actually not what this is about. India has a long-standing, from the Indian political context, commitment to what was called the non-aligned movement in the 1960s, various attempts, again, to sort of create fair terms of trade for poorer countries as they sought entry into the global economic system. And as India's own economy has also ramped up, and I forget their GDP growth rates, but also significantly higher than even the United States, leave alone Western Europe. I mean, the flip is that really Europe is going through what Africa went through in the 90s right now, right? In terms of austerity and economic crisis. And so these are, South-South trade broadly refers to efforts by various countries in the global South to circumvent those other avenues and directly build trading relationships. In the case of India, Mampili and Taylor point out that this is slightly different than the Chinese sort of state-led model. It's mostly private sector development, but the state is heavily involved. As these statistics point out, various ministries within the Indian government have portfolios that relate to promoting South-South trade in particular, but increasingly, obviously, telecommunications, not surprisingly, pharmaceuticals, huge. If you go to a pharmacy in all of Africa, you're likely to find you can buy a German prescription, and they'll offer you either an Indian or an Egyptian one, increasingly Indian ones. And the price differential is huge. And so, significant kind of comparative advantage in that, and an ability to offer more drugs at a cheaper price to a market where people want access to medicines, but need them to be a lot cheaper than a Western pharmaceutical company could ever offer them. And then obviously, like China, as its own population surges, has growing needs in energy. But also land. They're doing some land deals for rice cultivation. There's some large ones in Ethiopia that I've read about, for example. So, just another way that the Indian Ocean sort of community continues to interact. So you've got some rice cultivation going on in Western Ethiopia that's all about rice export to India. So it's a fascinating kind of change as both Indian subcontinent and certainly Africa, the economic situation changes. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Is that okay?
So in Tanzania and Kenya today, do you see politicians of Indian origin serving as ministers in the cabinet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that something pretty acceptable? Is it also mandated?
It's not mandated. There are mandates in the new Kenya constitution around gender and about regions that are meant to address ethnicity. So you do have a kind of set of rules that would capture the Swahili, Mijikenda, Arab identities, and so there'd be some sort of local county level governments basically that have been put in place. For Indian Kenyans and Asian Tanzanians who tend to be geographically more scattered, so they wouldn't benefit from local control kinds of political reforms, I'm not aware of any mandates, but and I actually can't remember if there must be an Indian Kenyan member of parliament, and I apologize that I didn't look that up. But it would be considered acceptable. In Kenya, they might not even have to speak Kiswahili. In Tanzania, I mean, that's why I love Mojuji's little website. It's an important part of sort of how he is. He's a Georgetown grad. He has impeccable English. He played tennis in Florida or something funny like that. But he will always speak in Kiswahili in Tanzania. So there's important ways that an individual has to signal their sort of local identity, keeping a home in Singida, having certain kinds of people employed in parts of his business. But I would argue, reasonable people could disagree, but I would definitely argue that it is acceptable in Tanzania for an Asian Tanzanian to be a member of parliament. What's more controversial, if I have a moment, or am I out of time? And this has come up in Tanzania when I've chatted with folks that I know at the university when I take students. Under Nyerere, no member of parliament was allowed to be in private business. I mean, Nyerere had a very specific idea of of business life and political life as needing to be separate. And this was about corruption primarily. The reforms of the 1990s broke that apart. So what's more controversial about someone like Emojuji is that his company alone, has around 10% of the national GDP. It's huge. I mean, he's number 31 on the Forbes Africa list, one of the youngest people. So that is pretty controversial. Now, that's not separable from his Asian identity, right? People understand that there were certain privileges that lead to that, but it wouldn't necessarily be articulated in that way in Tanzania, because I think people would see him as Tanzanian, but whether and that's also a generational thing. I think younger people are a little bit more comfortable with this model than older people who came of age under Nyerere and feel that that was a better model. Corruption is a huge issue in all of these countries of East Africa. So how to tackle that will become implicated in racial identity politics, right? Yeah.
Could you speak more about, you kind of brought up like modern Chinese issues, and so I was wondering if you could speak more about kind of this historical experience of people of Indian origin and how that compares to this more modern like Chinese influence in East Africa.
Yeah, it's a great sort of fertile area for discussion right now, because as much as you see newer waves of Indian technical assistance and migration of various forms, temporary and permanent, you certainly see larger waves of Chinese migrants for various reasons. First of all, I would say it varies. For example, President Nyerere had a very close relationship with Chairman Mao. And Tanzania I mean, not only was China historically trading in Zanzibar, right? I mean, Chinese goods have been found dating back centuries, but even in the immediate post-independence period, Nyerere in particular cultivated China, felt that the sort of agricultural basis of the Chinese Revolution was more appropriate than the Soviet industrialized one for an economy like Tanzania. So there's a main road in Dar, and I just love that they haven't taken this down. I'm so afraid they will. But there's a China-Tanzania textile factory that's no longer operating, but the sign is still there. And China helped to build the Tazara Railroad, which links Tanzania down to Zambia through several countries. So that line was built by the Chinese, right, where the British built the Uganda-Kenya line with these Indian indentured servants. So the Chinese involvement is not as modern as people think, right? It's not like 10 years ago. But it does vary. I mean, in Kenya and Uganda, I think arguably China is a fairly newer phenomenon, certainly in Ethiopia and other parts of the Horn, and it's contentious in some sense. It's I think gonna come back. I mean, I study language policy, right, and cultural policy. I mean, I think that's what it's gonna come down to. So what you see China doing, interestingly enough, is building Confucius Institutes so Addis Ababa University has a Confucius Institute, several Kenyan ones do. There's a big one at the University of Dar es Salaam, teaching Chinese language, bringing in folks to sort of grease the wheels of international cooperation, because until very recently that was not how things were done, right? Chinese laborers were brought in, they did not interact, they took away jobs, there was this sort of feeling of animosity. That feeling is mostly still there, but I think that we shouldn't underestimate China's ability to try to stem that anti-Chinese sentiment in ways that will work to its advantage. There certainly is evidence of an India-China cooperation in this South-South trade element, but I would tend to argue it's overblown. But again, I mean, there's lots of really brilliant people who would disagree with me and say that's the crux of it. Africa's just a playground for India, China, and the West to fight it out. I strongly disagree with that. I think these countries are very aware of who these partners are, and they're attempting to balance the labor and land demands that they continue to have in 2015. And they seek, wisely, I think, to diversify their options. And so they're delighted to invite President Obama to come and speak and even criticize them. But they will also invite Xi Jinping, and they will also invite the Premier of India and have these various kinds of plenaries and so on, because they would see, this is a better time for Africa economically than in the 90s, when all they had was the World Bank and the IMF and the US, right? There's a little bit more going on out there. So yeah. It's an exciting time. I might be out of time. What should I do?
We've got 2 minutes.
Great.
left, and so
Yay.
it's coffee
Yes,
break.
please.
Just a comment, thanks for your comments, a lot of great information. Just as we all leave, go back to different classes, different age kids, I just want to recommend a great film I stumbled upon. It's called The First Grader. It's a true story about an 81-year-old Kenyan man who, at age 81,
I've heard of this. Yeah.
because he received this important letter from the government. And I don't want to spoil it, he wants to read it on his own. And I showed it to my kids, and everybody was crying, I was crying, and what's important is a lot of flashbacks in the movie to his days as a Mau fighter. And a lot of things you talked about, you see in the movie. And I just stumbled upon it. It's an indie film, didn't get much play, but I was channel surfing one night late and bought it at Amazon.com, and every kid raved about it.
They loved it.
Every year.
That's great.
Somehow.
What's the name of it?
First Grader, right? I've heard of the gentleman. I've never seen the film.
The First Grader.
First Grader.
About an 81-year-old first grader.
Yeah.
He demands his right to learn how to read.
Because the 90s, the World Bank and the IMF imposed user fees, right? And so a lot of people lost out. I mean, Mau generation lost out because they were fighting and they didn't get to school. But in the 90s, there was a huge drop in primary education. And so the Millennium Development Goals, a commitment to primary education, Kenya was an early and strong supporter of that. And I think, I'm actually, my newest project is looking at civic education, citizen education I call it, because I don't really call it civic education, but what we would know as civic education in Kenya after the 2010 Constitution. And it's really, this is education as a right. The 90s were really considered the dark ages for many Kenyans. Politically, domestically, Moi was not a popular figure, but also socially, and introductions of user fees in education and basic health care just had a decimating effect on the health and education sector. So these sort of symbolic folks who sort of trumpet a national value of education, which I think arguably Kenyans have. It did get a lot of play. I haven't seen the film. Thank you for sharing. And it's fun. That's what I like about the Gates thing, right? Like we could sort of say the heart of Black Africa. What does that even mean? But it's evocative for our students. These are things they can relate to, and it's also it's a beautiful film visually. So if there's any segments of wonders of the African world that are useful to you, I would recommend them as well. Thank you.